want to conquer Europe. But at this point, we have only been to Basel, and now we of course come to Sweden. But this is just the beginning. We're an anonymous group. We're a group of women who call ourselves Guerrilla Girls, and it is a play, obviously, on guerrilla actions. And of course, we wear the masks because we want to be anonymous. We find that we speak for more women and women's rage in general. We find that being anonymous, it's empowering. And not only is it empowering, we feel that being anonymous, we also, it doesn't become personal when we target and point the finger at galleries that don't exhibit enough women's work, and dealers that don't are not as supportive as they should be, critics who are not writing enough about women artists, museums who are not showing enough women's work, and we find that it becomes less personal.
We began in 1985 when the Museum of Modern Art had an international survey of painting and sculpture. And out of 166 artists, fewer than 15 were women. And it made us stop and think, because in the late 70s there was a tremendously powerful movement in the art world among women artists that clearly made some gains for women artists. And we felt that during the 80s those gains were lost, and we wanted to let people know that. Whenever it was brought up in conversation, it was usually dismissed or not taken seriously, and we wanted to disseminate information about the declining status of women artists. It wasn't so much that we were trying to find a power that we've never had. The power was there and taken away. So we started putting posters on the streets, because of course the streets are free. And the earliest posters had statistics and named names of people who, in one way or another, consciously or unconsciously, participated in a kind of institutional discrimination against women.
We also decided to do it with humor, and we thought that would be a big difference between some of the earnestness that has been done in the 60s and 70s. So we have that humorous edge that that a lot of people, when they see the posters on the street, it's very eye-catching, it's funny, and yet it has quite just the right tone.
Which is your most controversial poster, in your opinion? And what did it cause? What kind of reaction did it cause?
I always think our most controversial poster is the next one we're going to be doing.
That's absolutely true, but I think the poster that was the most loved is The Advantages of Being a Women Artist. This is a fabulous poster because initially we started out with statistical information, and then we got to kind of a broader issue, and we actually had just the right sense of humor on it.
I think that looking back, perhaps the most controversial poster we did was the critics poster. That was very early on, where we went through the writing records of major critics in New York, and we calculated how many times they had reviewed work by women, not in terms of what they said, just the attention that they paid. And so we made the poster. These critics don't write enough about women artists, and we had about 15 critics. Curiously enough, 3 or 4 of the critics on that list are critics who identify themselves with liberal politics, and they were particularly upset. And there was a big rile in the press because critics want to think they don't have power when they do. And there was a brouhaha saying that their editors, of course, told them what to review, what not to review. So I think our earlier posters perhaps were more controversial than the ones we do now because they shocked people. They weren't used to them. And I think slowly we've become loved. think that, I mean, in all of our research and all of our questioning, we've really found that the art world is very conservative. And perhaps the world of culture in general is conservative, and perhaps more conservative than mass culture. It's a kind of reverse of the idea of the avant-garde, where artists in the cultural world always thought it was ahead of culture for a long time, and we've found that perhaps it's losing ground and perhaps it's behind the culture at large, and that women are far more easily accepted in the working world and given positions of authority than they are in the art world, because the art world labors under the myth of genius.
If you have museums that are outside of New York, there are many, many more women who have shows there than the big museums. So the hierarchy, the higher you get in the institution of art, the less women that are shown.
Well, we found that there's been an influx of European artists in New York over the last 10 years, and very few of them are women.
Do you get any support from white male artists?
No, but we're willing to take your money right here.
I think that the situation may be also in the art schools. Your art schools here tend to be, state-supported, state-run, and extremely important in the production of artists. It's not the same situation in our country. We're a little more anarchistic about education. But if women are not teaching in the art schools, what happens to them? What kind of role models do those female students have? And what ideas do they have about what they have to do to become a productive professional artist? What do they have to do to live from their work? If they don't see any other women doing it, it's just very hard for them to find a power within themselves. I think what you're asking is are we successful artists? And the answer is yes.
Women want to be incorporated in the whole history of art. They don't want, when it's separate, it's patronizing. When you think about women's art or women's work, you're talking about a diminutive term. And when you do that, you're talking about black and other things, and it's not on somehow an equal basis. I think that usually movements are very good when first that it's targeted to all women in general. So they have a support structure that's very important to have, so that they have role models. So there is access to that type of a system. And also they're not somehow, many times when male artists or the male power structure gets involved, women seem to, they put women's issues as somehow a lesser kind of a thing. When we're talking about basically civil rights, and it's as if, by the way, a black man will actually go to medical school and can only become an elevator operator. It's that kind of simplistic analogy.
I think if you look at culture in a broad sense, and you think of culture as being the most significant expression of a certain time and place, and you realize that 50%, of any population is female, that you would expect that, and if you admit that the experience of being female is different from the experience of being male for many different reasons, then female art, you would expect it to, in many ways, be different from male art. That doesn't mean to say that it's inferior. I think we've always labored under a kind of idea of culture as being, expressive of the experience of the elite or the ruling class. Well, I think it's time in the 20th century, we live in liberal democracies, to think of culture in a broader sense, and to also realize that our aesthetic judgments have been based on a power structure, and to open that up. And that if 50% of the working class, of the workforce are women, 50% of the population, is women, I think that if we're going to preserve that culture, and what's most significant about that culture, we have to have those voices heard. And we have to admit that that experience is important in the documentation of our life experience. And I don't know what argument could be said, to eliminate that. In America, we need to know what the experience of being black in America is. And finally, we're seeing it in films with Spike Lee. There are prominent, black writers talking about the black experience. Why is it in the art world that the black and the female experience are degraded, are devalued, are not considered high art? We have to ask that question. And also, women, as taxpayers, you have the right to demand that your public institutions include your experience, in their record of this time.
Jag tycker den här är bra. Den gula här uppe är bra.
Den är bra. Och den där fördelarna med
Ja.
Jag tycker den här, det är ett varmt
Ja, den är absolut
suverän.
Mycket, mycket bra.
Fördelarna med att vara en kvinnlig konstnär. Ho, ho, ho.
Men tycker jag att vi ska trycka upp små och börja plocka ut. Och dearest.
Leva med vetskapen om att din karriär kanske börjar stegra sig efter att du har fyllt 80. Ja. Ska du död och begraven.
Wow, and there's chans. Ja, det blir bra.
Nej, men de är skitbra. Sen gillar den där white bread också. White bread? Blir det samma galleri eller?
Nej, jag fattar som det var 2 gallerier. De låg vägg i vägg i alla fall. Och det var en kvinnlig konstnär och en manlig konstnär. Och bägge ställde ut akvareller.
Hur stora var de då?
Ha?
Hur stora var akvarellerna?
Ja, de var lika stora. Så det var ingen... Men de tyckte tjejens akvareller var mycket bättre. Men han tog 8-9 tusen och hon tog 1500 till 2000 för sina.
Ja, vi måste lära oss att ta betalt. Jag har själv gjort den där tabben helt nyligen.
Have you ever been, when you put up posters in illegal places, has it ever happened that the police comes and you get caught and, there's a legal action?
No, the worst that they do is they take the buckets of glue and dump them in the streets and tell us to disappear, and we run around the corner and then appear again. But we have done actions in other places, and this is something that we could encourage you to do at both the Whitney Museum, the Guggenheim, and also the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. When they did exhibitions that we felt underrepresented women and cultural others, we made statements and we went into the museums, into the toilet stalls, both the men's stalls and the women's stalls, and we did have male collaborators in that excursion. And inside the stalls, we taped up these statements. We also went into the bookstores and we put the statements inside every book in the museum bookstore. We also did small versions of the statements, and we put them in the postcard racks so that when people bought postcards, they would pull a postcard up and, there was a statement about the museum. So there are many ways to do it. There's so much information out there. There's so many different ways of getting it that we haven't had any difficulty. I mean, art is a public thing. You can go back through the newspapers and find information that way. It's just how you organize it. For example, we went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art one Sunday afternoon to count nude females versus nude males. I mean, that's right
weenie
there.
count.
We called it the weenie count. And we found something very different than we expected. We expected to find throughout, Western art from the Renaissance, there'd be many more naked females than naked males. And what we found out is there are so many naked baby Jesuses in Renaissance painting that it skewed the statistics, and it was only in the 19th century, and this is interesting to think about, it was only starting in the 19th century that the nude female became so important in art. So it makes you wonder if chauvinism isn't a modern phenomenon. And also, feminist art historians have found that it was the Victorian art historians who wrote women artists out of the history of art. That Sofonisba Gentileschi and Angelica Kaufman and many of the women artists who had prominent careers in the 17th and 18th century were then written out in the 19th century. So we have to think about that. And we did a poster, the poster about the Metropolitan Museum, the results of the weenie count. It went, do women have to be naked to get into the Metropolitan Museum? We had the Ang Odalisque with a gorilla mask on. And the line underneath it was, fewer than 5% of the artists in the modern art section of the museum are women, but more than 85% of the nudes are female. we presented that to a very important public art funding organization in New York, and they told us that it was not clear enough.
So we ran that actually in the buses of New York. And when we wanted to renew the contract, the bus system said, "I'm sorry, it's too obscene. We will not run this again."
You are now working as artists all the time while you're doing all this solidarity
That's right.
work. You have time to do that? Can you continue, or have you sort of set off a couple of years to do this? How can you manage?
It's very, very difficult. There's no question about it. Because the women who are involved in the group, most of them are artists. Almost all are artists. There are other people who are obviously from either arts organizations, curators, writers, etc., but most are artists. And it's very hard to, many of us have jobs that we make money on in order to support ourselves and our work. And also, we also are artists, and we get money from that, and we, etc., and some teach, and the combination of 5 jobs, basically. And this one also is extremely, actually the political action is extremely time consuming. There's no question about it. It's time consuming in terms of taking, thinking about what kind of political actions we intend to do, what we are actually do, and also, of course, the time to do the political actions, to make these posters, to have committee meetings, and also we're talking about this in the United States, all over the country, at universities, as well as other places, and in Europe. So we're talking, it's a lot of time.
But everybody knows that women's lives are difficult and we have to work twice as hard as anyone else, and that women always have 3 or 4 jobs. So I think that it is difficult and it's unfair, but we're good at it. How many Guerrilla girls are in the audience tonight? Clap for us. Well, I think an important thing that women have to realize is that they are treated as a class in the world. Many women have made their way as individuals, but oftentimes by pretending they're men or behaving like men or seeing themselves apart from women. They say, "I did this despite the fact that I was a woman," which is a very unfortunate, self-dreading, self-hating situation to be in. How can you make something despite the fact that you are what it is that you are? We've got to get past that. And the only way women are going to have power, I mean collective power, not power of individuals. They're always tokens. They're always people who break away, and get something for themselves and not worry about where it came from. We've got to get past that. And you also have to pressure the system to stop devaluing the experience of women. We found that in the last 15 years in the United States, that situation has changed. And very prominent women artists will now associate themselves with feminism because they realize in the end it helps them.